Each cerebral hemisphere presents three poles: frontal, occipital, and temporal. Poles refer to the extremities of brain and they serve as important surface landmarks. The frontal pole is situated anteriorly, the occipital pole is situated posteriorly, and the temporal pole is situated in between frontal and occipital and beneath them. And later on in our course of discussion, we will also see that frontal pole, temporal pole, and occipital pole belong to the lobes of the same name. The frontal pole is at the anterior end of the cerebral hemisphere, is more rounded than the occipital pole, and it lies opposite the medial part of superciliary arch. Superciliary arches are rounded and curved elevation above and parallel to the supraorbital margins on the frontal bone. The occipital pole lie at the posterior end of the hemisphere. It is more pointed than the frontal pole. It lies at a short distance superolateral to the external occipital protuberance. The temporal pole lies between frontal and occipital pole and point forwards. It fits into the anterior part of middle cranial fossa. Each cerebral hemisphere has three surfaces: superolateral, medial, and inferior. The superolateral surface is the most convex and most extensive. It faces upwards and laterally and conforms to the corresponding half of the cranial vault. The medial surface is flat and vertical. It presents a thick C-shaped cut surface known as corpus callosum. The inferior surface is irregular to adapt to the floors of anterior and middle cranial fossae, and it is divided into two parts by a deep horizontal groove or sulcus, which is known as the stem of lateral sulcus. And this stem of lateral sulcus divides it into a small anterior part, the orbital surface, and a large posterior part, the tentorial surface. The brain presents six borders apart from the three surfaces that we have already discussed. Each cerebral hemisphere presents six borders. The first is the superomedial border, which separates the superolateral surface. This is the superolateral surface. The superomedial border. This is the medial surface. Superolateral border separates the superolateral surface from medial surface. It separates the superolateral surface from the medial surface. Next is the inferolateral border. The inferolateral border, it separates the superolateral surface from orbital and tentorial surface. That is the outline of the inferolateral border. Inferolateral border separates the superolateral surface from orbital and tentorial surface. Number 2. The anterior part of inferolateral border, which separate the orbital surface from the superolateral surface, that means this part, it is known as the superciliary border. Number 3. Superciliary border or anterior part of the inferolateral border. 4, 5, 6 are the medial orbital border, the hippocampal border and medial occipital border. First, about the medial orbital border. Medial orbital border separates the orbital surface from the medial surface. Separates orbital surface from medial surface. That is a medial orbital border. Number 4. Number 5 is this one. Medial occipital border. Medial occipital border separates the tentorial surface from medial surface. So medial orbital border separates orbital surface from medial surface. Medial occipital border separates tentorial surface from medial surface. And in between them, the border which intervenes between the medial orbital and medial occipital border and wind round the crus cerebri, it is known as a hippocampal border. Actually, the crus cerebri are part of the midbrain. The cross section of the midbrain is like this. The anterior part is occupied by the two crus cerebri. So around the crus cerebri, the hippocampal border is winding round. Okay. The cerebral cortex or the surface layer of grey matter is highly extensive in man. To accommodate it in the limited space available within the rigid cranial cavity, the surface of cerebral hemisphere becomes folded. and in this process of folding it produces numerous convolutions separated by fissures. So the cerebral cortex is getting folded up like this. Producing numerous convolutions separated by fissures. These convolutions and fissures are termed gyri and sulci respectively. These convolutions are termed gyri, or in singular gyras, and the fissures which separates the convolutions are called sulci, in plural, singular sulcus. A brain with such convoluted cerebral cortex is called gyrencephalic brain. So this kind of folded cortex leads to gyrencephalic brain, while the one with a smooth cortex without such folding is called the lissencephalic. So gyrencephalic brain and lissencephalic brain. Okay. In general, man and other higher mammals have gyrencephalic brain. So man plus higher mammals, they produce the gyrencephalic brain or brain with convolution, while the reptiles, birds and lower mammals have lissencephalic brain. Reptile, birds and lower mammals have the lissencephalic brain. Okay. As I have already told that due to folding of the cortex, gyri and sulci are created. Sulci are the fissures and gyri, or in singular gyras, are the ridges or elevations. Now these sulci vary in depth from slight grooves to deep fissures, and some of them are sufficiently deep to indent the wall of the lateral ventricle. Ventricles are cavities within the brain, so some of the sulci are so deep that they make indentation in the wall of the cavity that lie within the depth of cerebral hemispheres. Now functionally these sulci are of different types: limiting, axial, operculated, some of the sulci are also known as complete sulci. Then there are primary and secondary sulcus. We are all going to discuss it one by one. complete sulcus, primary sulcus, secondary sulcus. So what all these terms means? Let's discuss the limiting sulcus first. The limiting sulcus is one which separates two different functional areas. Functional areas refer to areas of cerebral cortex which are supposed to control a particular function of the body. So if we draw the sulcus with its flanking gyri like this, then the limiting sulcus is one which is flanked by two different functional areas. Let us draw the functional areas with particular color. Suppose this is one particular functional area on one side of the sulcus marked by red. It is functional area A, and on other side of the sulcus there is another functional area marked by green, functional area B. So functional area A is separated from functional area B by the limiting sulcus. Example of such sulcus is central sulcus, which separates the motor cortex in front from the sensory cortex behind. So example of such limiting sulcus is central sulcus. We'll discuss about the central sulcus later. Next in line is the axial sulcus. What is an axial sulcus? Again, you draw the sulcus and its flanking gyri like this. This is the sulcus. In case of axial sulcus, a particular functional area grow alongside the sulcus. That means on both sides of the sulcus there will be the same functional area. Okay. In case of an axial sulcus, a particular functional area grow alongside the sulcus. Okay. Posterior part of calcarine sulcus is an example of axial sulcus, since the visual cortex grows along it. Example is posterior part of calcarine sulcus, which is also known as post-calcarine sulcus. The visual cortex grows along it. Visual cortex. Then we get to see the operculated sulcus next. Number 3. Operculated sulcus. An operculated sulcus is one where its walls and floor contain a particular functional area, whereas its two lips contain two separate functional area. For example, in this diagram, the operculated sulcus, the wall and floor contain functional area A, and its two lips contain functional area B and functional area C respectively. So this type of sulcus, where the walls and floor containing one functional area and its two lips separate to other functional areas, is known as operculated sulcus. For example, lunate sulcus is such an operculated sulcus. Lunate sulcus is such an one. Next we discuss the complete sulcus. We know that the substance of a brain contains cavities. Suppose there is a surface. Now within the substance there is a cavity which is known as ventricle. Now some of the sulci are so deep that they indent the wall of the ventricles. So let's draw such a sulci. Suppose there is one such sulci which is very deep. So this sulcus provides an indentation. See, this sulcus is so deep it produces elevation in the wall of the ventricle. This kind of sulcus is called complete sulcus. Example of this sulcus, the collateral sulcus is a complete sulcus. Collateral sulcus is example of such a complete sulcus because they form a collateral eminence in the floor of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle. The last two kinds are the primary and secondary sulcus. What is a primary sulcus? Most of the sulci are primary sulcus because they develop independently. So primary sulcus is one which develop independently, whereas secondary sulci are dependent on other factors for their development. Secondary sulcus development depends on other factors. For example, the lateral sulcus. It is a secondary kind of cortex. It is a secondary kind of sulcus. For example, lateral sulcus, which is secondary kind of sulcus. Now after the sulci, after the detailed discussion about the variation of the sulci, next let's talk a bit about the gyri. The gyri consist of a central core of white matter. So if I take a gyri, it contains a central core of white matter. Okay, and covered by a layer. So let's talk a bit about the gyri. The gyri consists of a central core of white matter. It is a central core of white matter. covered by a layer of gray matter. So altogether, this gray matter covering and white matter core forms a gyri. Gyrus. It is to be noted that the total surface area of cerebral hemisphere is about 2000 centimeter square, but approximately 2/3 of this is hidden from the surface view. Why? If we draw the picture, it will become clear. This is the orientation of the sulci and gyri, right? So when we are seeing from the surface view, only these areas are coming into view, and the rest of the areas are hidden from our view. So that's why 2/3 of the cortex is hidden from the surface view within the walls of the sulci. Hidden from view, 2/3. One third is in view. Okay. There is a great deal of individual variation in the details of sulci and gyri. Therefore, the following discussion will deal with only some important sulci and gyri. Let's talk about the main cerebral sulci. The main cerebral sulci are those who are fairly constant in position and shape, and they include central, lateral, parieto-occipital and calcarine sulcus. Central, lateral, parieto-occipital and calcarine sulcus. Central sulcus of Rolando. It begins by cutting the superomedial border. This is the superomedial border. And central sulcus begins by cutting the superomedial border. One centimeter below the midpoint between the frontal and occipital pole. This is the midpoint between the frontal pole in front and occipital pole behind. 1 centimeter behind the midpoint, the central sulcus begins its journey. It runs sinuously downward and forward and ends just above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The posterior ramus of lateral sulcus is this. This is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So central sulcus end up just above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The central sulcus forms the boundary between the motor area of the cerebral hemisphere in front. So in front is the motor area and the sensory area behind, and behind is the sensory area. Boundary between motor and sensory area. The upper end of the central sulcus usually extend onto the medial surface. So if I look at the cerebral hemisphere from the medial surface, we can see the upper end of the central sulcus that is carried towards the medial surface. Upper end of central sulcus. The calcarine sulcus is present mainly on the medial surface of the cerebral hemispheres. It begins as a deep fissure a little below the posterior end of the corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum. The cut section of the corpus callosum that is seen on the medial surface is C-shaped. This is the posterior end of corpus callosum or splenium. The calcarine sulcus begins a little below the posterior end of corpus callosum, which is called the splenium, and then it follows an arched course with a convexity directed upwards to the occipital pole, and it may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. So it may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. So that is the calcarine sulcus. So the extension of the calcarine sulcus onto the superolateral surface can be seen if the superolateral surface is seen from the lateral aspect. At the superolateral aspect, the last part of the calcarine sulcus, which wind round the occipital pole, can be seen. Part of calcarine sulcus on superolateral surface. Parieto-occipital sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus is present on the medial surface of the hemisphere. It begins at the midpoint of calcarine sulcus. Let's draw the calcarine sulcus first. From the midpoint of the calcarine sulcus, the parieto-occipital sulcus begins, and it courses upward and slightly backward to cut the superomedial border. This is the superomedial border. So the parieto-occipital sulcus is cutting the superomedial border and may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. That is the last part of parieto-occipital sulcus on superolateral surface. Lateral sulcus of Sylvius. The lateral sulcus is the most conspicuous of the cerebral sulci and has a stem and 3 rami. The stem of the sulcus begins as a deep cleft on the inferior surface of cerebral hemisphere. This is the stem of the sulcus, and it begins as a deep cleft on the inferior surface of cerebral hemisphere at the anterior perforated substance. This region is the anterior perforated substance. From the anterior perforated substance, it begins and it extends laterally between the orbital surface and the tentorial surface, and thereafter on reaching the inferolateral border, this pole is basically the inferolateral border. On reaching the inferolateral border, it winds round the border and go on to the superolateral surface. So it winds round the inferolateral border and reach the superolateral surface. After reaching the superolateral surface, it divides into 3 rami. 1, 2 and 3 rami. R1, R2, R3, representing the 3 rami. R1 is called the anterior horizontal. R1 is the anterior horizontal. R2 is the anterior ascending. R1 or anterior horizontal, it passes forward. R2 or anterior ascending, it passes upward. And both R1 and R2 are of same length, that is about 2.5 centimeter. Regarding R3, it is the posterior ramus, which is the main part of the lateral sulcus, and it is the largest rami. It is about 7.5 centimeter long, thrice the length of R1 or R2, and runs posteriorly and slightly upward across the superolateral surface, and it ends in the inferior parietal lobule of the parietal lobe by an upturned posterior end. The posterior end is upturned. So posterior ramus ends in inferior parietal lobule, a part of parietal lobe, by an upturned posterior end. The 3 rami of lateral sulcus diverge from each other at a point which is called the Sylvian point. So what is the Sylvian point? This point where the 3 rami diverge from each other is known as the Sylvian point. Point of divergence of 3 rami. The inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere is divided by the stem of lateral sulcus into orbital surface in front and the tentorial surface behind. This is the stem of lateral sulcus. This stem of lateral sulcus divides the inferior surface into a smaller orbital surface and a larger tentorial surface behind. This stem commences from a depression known as the anterior perforated substance. So the beginning of the stem is from a depression, and this depression is known as anterior perforated substance. This is the area of the anterior perforated substance. The anterior perforated substance is bounded in front by the olfactory trigone formed by the divergence of medial and lateral olfactory stria. This is the medial olfactory stria, this is the lateral olfactory stria. Medial olfactory stria, lateral olfactory stria. Medially it is bound by the optic chiasma. So on the medial side it is bound by the optic chiasma. This is optic chiasma. And posterolaterally it is bound by the uncus of temporal lobe. This is the uncus. The curved anterior portion of the parahippocampal gyrus, about which we are going to discuss later, is called the uncus. So all these structures bound the anterior perforated substance. So the outline of the anterior perforated substance is like this, and it is named so because this area of anterior perforated substance, it is pierced or perforated by the central branches of the middle cerebral arteries. Pierced by central branches of middle cerebral artery. So that is about the anterior perforated substance. Now coming to the orbital surface. The orbital surface is slightly concave and formed by the lower surface of the frontal lobe. So orbital surface is formed by the lower surface of frontal lobe. Orbital surface formed by lower surface of frontal lobe. An olfactory sulcus extends anteroposteriorly. This is the outline of the olfactory sulcus that was extending anteroposteriorly. Close to the medial frontal margin. That is the medial frontal margin. Medial frontal margin. The olfactory sulcus lodges the olfactory bulb and its tract. Let's draw the olfactory bulb. This expanded area is called the olfactory bulb, and it is continuous behind as the olfactory tract. So this is the olfactory bulb, bulbous expansion, and behind it is continuous at olfactory tract. Olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. The tract reaches the anterior perforated substance. So the tract is reaching this area, which is already been discussed, anterior perforated substance, and diverge into medial and lateral olfactory striae. So the tract is diverging into medial and lateral olfactory striae. This is the medial olfactory striae on the medial side, and the rest is lateral olfactory striae. Medial olfactory stria, lateral olfactory stria. The elongated area medial to the olfactory sulcus is called the gyrus rectus. This area, elongated area medial to the olfactory sulcus, is known as gyrus rectus. And the rest of the orbital surface lateral to the olfactory sulcus is divided by a figure of H sulcus, which is also known as orbital sulcus. So this is the figure of H sulcus lateral to the olfactory sulcus, and it divides the rest of the orbital surface into 4 orbital gyri: anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyri. So that is about the orbital surface. Coming to the tentorial surface, which is more extensive than the orbital surface, it is convexo-concave from before backwards. So tentorial surface is convexo-concave from before backwards, and is formed by the inferior surface of temporal and occipital lobes. So it is formed by the inferior surface of temporal lobe and inferior surface of occipital lobe. Temporal, occipital, inferior surface of both. Its anterior part of the tentorial surface, it rests on the middle cranial fossa. So anterior part of the tentorial surface, anterior part, it rests on the middle cranial fossa, whereas the posterior part of the tentorial surface, this part, rests on the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli. The tentorium cerebelli is a dural fold which intervenes between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Tentorium cerebelli is a dural fold that intervenes between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The tentorial surface presents 2 anteroposterior sulci, 2 occipitotemporal and collateral. The temporal surface presents 2 anteroposteriorly oriented sulci. The medial one is called the collateral sulcus, and the lateral one is the occipito-temporal sulcus. These are the two anteroposteriorly oriented sulci on the inferior surface. The medial one is the collateral sulcus, and the lateral one is the occipito-temporal sulcus. These two sulci divide the surface into three gyri: lateral and medial occipito-temporal and parahippocampal gyri. So the three gyri that are resulted from these two sulci are this one, first lateral occipito-temporal gyrus, then medial occipito-temporal gyrus, and most medially the parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus. So these are the name of the three from medial to lateral: parahippocampal most medially, medial occipito-temporal gyrus next to it, and lateral occipito-temporal gyrus most laterally. Now the collateral sulcus, it is a complete sulcus, as have earlier been discussed, because it projects into the inferior horn of lateral ventricle as collateral eminence. It is a complete sulcus. Complete sulcus means they produce a bulge in the wall of the ventricles. Ventricles are the inner cavities within the brain. Anteriorly, the collateral sulcus is continuous with the rhinal sulcus. So let's clear out this diagram. This collateral sulcus anteriorly is continuous with the rhinal sulcus. The anterior part of the collateral sulcus is called the rhinal sulcus, which forms the lateral boundary of the uncus on the medial side of temporal pole. Actually, uncus is hook-like curved anterior end of the parahippocampal gyrus. You remember, this is the parahippocampal gyrus. The hook-like anterior curved end of the parahippocampal gyrus is called uncus, and the lateral boundary of the uncus is made by the rhinal sulcus. The uncus forms a part of the pyriform lobe, and it acts as the primary receptive area for the olfaction. Primary receptive area for olfaction. The uncus is continuous behind with the parahippocampal gyrus. Uncus is continuous behind with the parahippocampal gyrus. And the parahippocampal gyrus is limited laterally by the collateral sulcus. That is obvious. This is the collateral sulcus. Let's take a look at the coronal section of the brain to get a better understanding of the inferior surface. So on the coronal surface, this is the inferior surface of the brain, which is occupied by two longitudinally disposed sulci. On the medially, we get the collateral sulcus. So this one is the collateral, and laterally it is occupied by the occipitotemporal sulcus. Now on the medial side of the collateral sulcus, we know there is the presence of parahippocampal gyrus. So parahippocampal gyrus is this one. Parahippocampal gyrus. If you trace the parahippocampal gyrus and go further medially, we will see that parahippocampal gyrus is overlapped medially and above by another gyrus that is called dentate gyrus. This is the dentate gyrus. See this green color. This is overlapping the parahippocampal gyrus from medial and above. So this is called dentate gyrus. Let's see the diagram in a bit enlarged view. See, this is the collateral sulcus. Collateral sulcus. Tally it with the former picture. This is the collateral sulcus. Medial to the collateral sulcus is the parahippocampal gyrus. In blue, the parahippocampal gyrus. And it is overhung medially and above by the dentate gyrus. Dentate gyrus. This is the occipitotemporal gyrus. This sulcus between the dentate gyrus above and parahippocampal gyrus below is called as hippocampal sulcus. So this is a brief review of the inferior surface of brain. Let's discuss the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The presence of corpus callosum is the most conspicuous feature on the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere. It is a C-shaped thick bundle of commissural fibers, and it is actually the largest bundle of commissural fibers. The commissural fibers are those which connect the identical or corresponding areas of two cerebral hemispheres. So commissural fibers are also known as interhemispheric fibers. The outline of the corpus callosum is C-shaped with convexity outwards, that is seen on the medial surface. Medial surface is exposed after cutting the brain through a sagittal section. So that is the outline of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is divided from before backward into 4 parts. From before backward, number 1, rostrum, number 2, genu, number 3, trunk or body, and number 4, splenium or the posterior end. This is the rostrum. This curved anterior extremity is called the genu. Next is the trunk. There is the main or middle part. And the massive posterior part is known as the splenium. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about the parts. First we talk about the genu. The genu is the thick curved anterior extremity of the corpus callosum. So this thick curved anterior extremity forms the genu. And it lies 4 cm behind the frontal pole. This is the frontal pole. The genu is lying 4 cm behind the frontal pole. The genu extends downward and backward as a thin prolongation, which is known as the rostrum. So rostrum is a backward and downward prolongation of genu. The trunk is the main middle part of the corpus callosum between the thick anterior curved genu and the posterior part. The posterior part is known as the splenium. So splenium is the massive thick posterior extremity of the corpus callosum, which is lying 6 cm in front of occipital pole. That is the occipital pole lying 6 cm in front of occipital pole. Frontal pole. So these are the 4 parts of the corpus callosum as seen on the medial surface. The next feature are as follows. Number 1 is the cingulate sulcus. It is the most prominent sulcus, which follows a curved course about 1 cm above and parallel to the upper convex margin of corpus callosum. So this is the cingulate sulcus, 1 cm above and parallel to the upper convex margin of corpus callosum. Anteriorly, it ends below the genu of corpus callosum. Anteriorly. And posteriorly, it turns upward to reach the superomedial border of the hemisphere. The superomedial border of the hemisphere is this one. The superomedial border, it separates the superolateral surface from the medial surface. This is the superomedial border. So the posterior end of the cingulate sulcus reaches the superomedial border of the hemisphere, a little bit behind the upper end of central sulcus. You remember the upper end of central sulcus was extended into the medial surface to some extent, and that is the upper end of central sulcus. So a little bit behind the upper end of central sulcus, the posterior upturned end of singular sulcus reaches to reach the superomedial border. The area between the cingulate sulcus and the corpus callosum is known as cingulate gyrus. So the area between the cingulate sulcus and corpus callosum is known as the cingulate gyrus. The callosal sulcus separates the cingulate gyrus from the corpus callosum. So in between the corpus callosum and the cingulate gyrus is the callosal sulcus. Callosal sulcus. This is the cingulate sulcus. In between the two sulci, in between the cingulate sulcus and callosal sulcus, lies the cingulate gyrus. Okay. Now we will discuss about the paracentral lobule. I already mentioned that the posterior end of the cingulate sulcus turn upward to reach the superomedial border. This is the superomedial border. An offshoot sulcus springs upward from the cingulate sulcus. An offshoot sulcus, this one, is springing upward from the cingulate sulcus and is running upward. The area of the medial surface in front of the offshoot sulcus and above the cingulate sulcus is known as the medial frontal gyrus. And this offshoot sulcus, along with the superomedial border and the posterior upturned end of the cingulate sulcus, they enclose an area which is known as the paracentral lobule, which is the cortical center of micturition. It's the highest center of micturition and defecation. So the boundaries of the paracentral lobule are as follows. It is bounded above by the superomedial border. So the paracentral lobule is bounded above by the superomedial border. below by the cingulate sulcus, below by the cingulate sulcus, posteriorly by the upturned posterior end of the cingulate sulcus, posteriorly by the upturned posterior end by the cingulate sulcus, upturned posterior end of cingulate sulcus, and anteriorly it is bound by an offshoot sulcus. This paracentral lobule is the highest center of micturition and defecation. This paracentral lobule is divided by the downturned upper end of the central sulcus. I told you that central sulcus extend slightly into the medial surface. So this downturned upper end of the central sulcus that extend into the medial surface divide the paracentral lobule into an anterior and posterior area. This is the outline of calcarine sulcus, which has already been described, and this is the posterior thick end of corpus callosum, which is known as the splenium. In between the splenium and anterior part of the calcarine sulcus, the small area is known as isthmus. Isthmus. The parieto-occipital sulcus has also been described. The triangular area between the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus, which is called the post-calcarine sulcus, posterior part of calcarine sulcus or post-calcarean sulcus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus is called the cuneus. So cuneus is the triangular area between the parieto-occipital sulcus and posterior end of calcarine sulcus or post-calcarine sulcus. The quadrangular area in front of the cuneus and behind the paracentral lobule, let's draw the paracentral lobule. It is called precuneus. Precuneus is separated from the cingulate gyrus by a small sulcus. It is called suprasplenial sulcus. Suprasplenial sulcus. This lies a little above and parallel to the splenium. Suprasplenial sulcus. The rostrum of the corpus callosum curves backward from the genu. This is the genu of the corpus callosum, and the rostrum curves backward and downward from the genu, and the rostrum is continuous below with the lamina terminalis. This is the lamina terminalis. Genu rostrum, lamina terminalis. The lamina terminalis represents the cranial end of primitive neural tube, and it extends as a thin sheet of gray matter from the rostrum to the upper surface of optic chiasma. This is the optic chiasma. So lamina terminalis is extending from the rostrum to the upper surface of the optic chiasma. That is the lamina terminalis. Next we will discuss about the septum pellucidum. Just in front of the lamina terminalis there are paraterminal and parolfactory gyri and anterior and posterior parolfactory sulci. It is a bilaminar partition consisting of both grey and white matter, and it extends from the undersurface of corpus callosum to the upper surface of body of fornix. This structure is known as the body of fornix. Fornix is a curved band of white matter. Fornix is a curved band of white matter. And it is formed principally by the projection fibers. Projection fibers are those fibers which connect the cerebral cortex with subcortical grey matter. The fornix consists of a body, crura and columns. So the fornix has got this part: body of fornix, crura of fornix and column fornix. Body lies between the crura and the column. Now coming back to the septum pellucidum. Septum pellucidum extends from the undersurface of corpus callosum to the upper surface. This is the undersurface of corpus callosum to the upper surface of body of fornix. So that is the septum pellucidum, a bilaminar partition. Between the undersurface of the body of the fornix and upper surface, undersurface of the corpus callosum and upper surface of the body of the fornix. On coronal section, this is the septum pellucidum. Between the body of fornix below and undersurface of corpus callosum above. This is the corpus callosum. Let's talk about the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. The superolateral surface is the convex and most extensive surface of cerebral hemispheres. In the superolateral surface belonging to the frontal lobe, we get the precentral sulcus. That precentral sulcus, it is broken into 2 or 3 parts and it runs downwards and forwards, parallel and little anterior to the central sulcus. This is the precentral sulcus. Running downwards and forwards, parallel and anterior to the central sulcus. This one is the central sulcus. So precentral sulcus is running in front of the central sulcus and parallel to it. The area between the central and precentral sulci is called precentral gyrus. So this area is called precentral gyrus. Anterior to the precentral sulcus, there are 2 sulci called superior and inferior frontal sulci. This is the superior frontal sulcus. This is the inferior frontal sulcus. Superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus. These 2 sulci divide the region of the frontal lobe which lie in front of the precentral sulcus into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. So superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus. So these 2 sulci divide the area of the frontal lobe in front of the precentral sulcus into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. Now the anterior and ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. Let's clear out the picture. Let's talk about the inferior frontal gyrus. This is the inferior frontal sulcus and this region is the inferior frontal gyrus. Inferior frontal gyrus. The anterior and ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. This is the anterior and this is the ascending rami of lateral sulcus. Anterior rami of lateral sulcus ascending ramus of lateral sulcus. These two rami, anterior and ascending rami of the lateral sulcus, divide the inferior frontal gyrus into three parts. The part below the anterior ramus is called the part orbitalis. So part orbitalis is the part below the anterior ramus. This part. So part orbitalis is actually belonging to the inferior frontal gyrus and it lies below the anterior rami of the lateral sulcus. This is called pars orbitalis. The part between the anterior and ascending rami is called pars triangularis. This area in between the anterior and ascending rami is called pars triangularis. And the part posterior to the ascending ramus is called pars opercularis. This portion is pars opercularis. So these are the three subdivisions of inferior frontal gyrus: pars opercularis, pars triangularis and pars orbitalis, from behind forwards. Now if we take a look at the parietal lobe, we will see that the post central sulcus run downward and forward. This is the post central sulcus. This one is the central sulcus. Post central sulcus running downward and forward, a little behind and parallel to the central sulcus. The area between these two is called the post central gyrus. So this area is known as post central gyrus. The rest of the parietal lobe is divided into a superior and inferior parietal lobule by an intraparietal sulcus. This is the intraparietal sulcus. Which divide the rest of the parietal lobe into a superior and inferior parietal lobules. So the area above it is known as superior parietal lobule and the area below it is the inferior parietal lobule, above and below the intraparietal sulcus respectively. Now the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus have got three rami. The largest is the posterior ramus, this one. and two other are anterior horizontal and anterior ascending. The posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus ends with an upturned end. Okay. Now, posterior upturned end of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and also the posterior ends of superior and inferior temporal sulci. This is the superior temporal sulcus. This is the inferior temporal sulcus. The posterior end of both of them also extend into the parietal lobe. Okay. Posterior end of the posterior ramus of the, this is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, posterior end of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus as well as of superior temporal sulcus and inferior temporal sulcus. They extend into the inferior parietal lobule. So into the inferior parietal lobule we get the posterior ends of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus. The gyrus that surrounds the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus in its posterior part is called the supramarginal gyrus. This is the supramarginal gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus, the gyrus which surround the posterior end of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and the gyrus that surround the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus is called the angular gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus and angular gyrus. Okay. So these are the important features in the superlateral surface of the parietal lobe. Regarding the superlateral surface of the temporal lobe, we get two important sulci that run parallel to the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus that I have already mentioned. Again, this is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus with an upturned posterior end, and there are two sulci that run parallel to it, 1 and 2 along the temporal lobe, and they are termed superior and inferior temporal sulci. Superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus, posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. These sulci divide the temporal lobe into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyri. So it is the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus, divided by these sulci. The superior surface of superior temporal gyrus presents transverse temporal gyri. Transverse temporal gyri. So the superior surface of superior temporal gyrus presents transverse temporal gyri. Actually, there are two transverse temporal gyri present. Transverse temporal gyri. There are two of them, and the anterior transverse temporal gyrus is called the Hessel's gyrus. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus is called Hessel's gyrus. Hessel's gyrus. Hessel's gyrus. The superlateral surface of the occipital lobe presents three short sulci: lunate sulcus, lateral occipital sulcus, and transverse occipital sulcus. First, the lunate sulcus. The lunate sulcus is a C-shaped sulcus with forward convexity just in front of the occipital pole. Lunate sulcus. The lateral occipital sulcus runs horizontally and divides the occipital lobe into superior and inferior occipital gyri. So this is the lateral occipital sulcus. Okay. And there is another that is called transverse occipital sulcus, which run downward into the uppermost part of the occipital lobe from the supromedial border a little behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. Let's see whether you can see the transverse occipital sulcus. That is the transverse occipital sulcus, a little bit behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is parieto-occipital, a sulcus that intervenes between the parietal lobe in front and occipital lobe behind. A little bit behind it, there is transverse occipital sulcus. Running downward into the uppermost part of the occipital lobe from the supromedial border. Here is the lunate sulcus. Lunate sulcus, and the lateral occipital sulcus is over here. Lateral occipital sulcus. So these are the important features on the superlateral surface of the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. Division of lobes of cerebral hemisphere on the superlateral surface. There are four lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. There are four lobes on the superlateral surface, and this is done with the help of three main sulci: central, lateral, and parieto-occipital sulci. This is the central sulcus. This is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, and this is the parieto-occipital sulcus. Central sulcus, posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and parieto-occipital sulcus. These three sulci along with two imaginary lines. The first imaginary line is a line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch. This is the pre-occipital notch. Pre-occipital notch in front of the occipital pole. An imaginary line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus with pre-occipital notch is termed as the first imaginary line. First imaginary line. And the second imaginary line is a backward continuation of the horizontal part of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. Let's draw the second imaginary line. The second line is a backward continuation of the horizontal part of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The most posterior part of lateral sulcus is rather upwardly curved, so the horizontal part is posteriorly continued as second imaginary line. So this is the second imaginary line. Now the frontal lobe lies anterior to the central sulcus, anterior to the central sulcus and above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. That is the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe lies behind the central sulcus and in front of the upper part of first imaginary line. This is the upper part of first imaginary line, and below the parietal lobe is bound by the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the second imaginary line. The posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the second imaginary line. The temporal lobe, it lies below the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and second imaginary line, and it is separated from the occipital lobe by the lower part of first imaginary line. This is the lower part of first imaginary line. The occipital lobe lies behind the line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch. That means it lies behind the first imaginary line. So that's how the lobes of cerebral hemisphere onto the superolateral surface is determined. The lateral sulcus on coronal section is this. The insula is the submerged or hidden portion of the cerebral cortex in the floor of the lateral sulcus. So the floor of the lateral sulcus is formed by this part of the cerebral cortex which is hidden from view. This is called insular cortex. It has been submerged from the surface during development of the brain due to overgrowth of the surrounding cortical areas and can be seen only when the lips of the lateral sulcus are widely pulled apart. These are the lips of the lateral sulcus. When these lips are widely pulled apart, only then the insula or the insular cortex is visible. In this diagram, we can see that the lips of the lateral sulcus have been pulled apart and the insula or insular cortex or central lobe, whichever name you choose to call it by, it has been exposed. It is triangular in shape and surrounded all around by a sulcus, which is called the circular sulcus, except anteroinferiorly at its apex, known as Lyman insulae, which is continuous with the anterior perforated substance. The insula is divided into two regions, anterior and posterior, by a central sulcus. Central sulcus. The part anterior to it is the anterior region, the part posterior to it is the posterior region. This is the central sulcus. The anterior region presents 3 to 4 short gyri called gyri brevia. Gyri brevia. And the posterior region presents 1 to 2 long gyri called gyri longa. Gyri longa. The insula is hidden from the surface view by the overgrown cortical areas of frontal, parietal and temporal lobes. These areas are termed frontal, frontoparietal and temporal opercula. So this is the frontal operculum. This is the frontoparietal operculum. And this is the temporal operculum.